Today, as Sri says, I'm going to be talking about friendship, and this is following on from Peter's talk at the last gathering, which was on committed relationships. So in terms of the structure of today, I'm going to be providing what I think is a useful model of friendship and draw out some important qualities which I think can be applied to our lives generally. I'll then turn to C.S. Lewis and his views on friendship as a form of love, and close with some implications for us as a covenant community. So when Tim asked me to do this talk on friendship a couple of weeks ago, the first thing that came into my mind was C.S. Lewis and J.R.R Tolkien. There's a lot of different avenues I could have taken in this talk, but I thought it might be best to try and sustain a focus on a particular friendship and just see what we can actually draw out of that. And I think that C.S. Lewis and Tolkien present a really useful model of the potential of friendship. And I'd argue that they're perhaps one of the most successful and productive Christian friendships of the last century, at least in terms of the tangible fruit that we can identify that's grown out of their friendship. So I'll frame this around the Inklings, who were an informal group of writers and academics at Oxford University, and Lewis and Tolkien were probably the two most famous members. The Inklings had no agendas or rules. It wasn't a club or a guild in any formal way. The basic thing that they had in common was that they were all Christian and they were all based around Oxford. They met for the most part every Tuesday night in C.S. Lewis's rooms in Magdalen College or at the local pub, and they did this for decades. And if we want to understand the values of the Inklings or their views on friendship, I think it's worthwhile to look to their books. The Chronicles of Narnia and The Lord of the Rings point to Lewis and Tolkien's deep understanding for and appreciation of friendship as a transformative force. We find friendships such as Lucy and Mr. Tumnus or Reaper Cheap and Prince Caspian in Lewis's books. In Tolkien, there's Bilbo and Gandalf, Legolas and Gimli, and perhaps most notably Sam and Frodo, whose profound friendship is at the very heart of the victory over evil at the end of The Lord of the Rings. So Merry and Pippin, who are another good model of friendship, make this point when they say to Frodo, "You can trust us to stick to you through thick and thin, to the bitter end, but you cannot trust us to let you face trouble alone and go off without a word. We are your friends, Frodo." So Peter Kreeft calls this quality of friendship within Tolkien's work withness. So this idea of friendship as withness, the quality of being with, just being there, it's well illustrated in the book of Job. So after Job's devastation, where he lost his property, his children, his servants, his health, three of his friends heard of his troubles and decided to go and console him. So in Job 2:13, it says that they sat with Job on the ground for 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. So this kind of withness, which we see in Job and in The Lord of the Rings, it's at a particular extreme, and I think one based around Lewis and Tolkien's shared experiences of being in the Great War and the friendships that grow out of that kind of adversity. But withness is also about the more banal, everyday acts of being there through the rhythm of life. So just to reflect briefly on my own experience of this, for several years, every Thursday night, I would meet with a group of friends after work and we would have dinner and we'd go and see a movie. Sometimes we'd see 2 movies, depending on what was on. And because we did it every Thursday night, it was easy to sustain. There was no worrying about scheduling or fitting it in. The routine of it was part of the thing, I think. And it played a big role in establishing deep friendships which have gone on long after the routine itself has stopped. And I think my sharing group, and you probably all identify this as well, is the routine of the sharing group also has had a big role, and there's real kind of profound friendships that grow out of that over time. It's certainly something we can recognise in the Inklings, this quality of withness, meeting at the same time and place as they did for decades. So the main purpose of the Inklings was as a space for members to read and discuss their writing. And they would often do this late into the night. Lewis's science fiction trilogy, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit were first read to, critiqued by, and necessarily improved by the Inklings, and much of Lewis's apologetic work was read to them as well. So a brief observation I want to make here is how the Inklings turned the act of writing, which is often an entirely solitary thing, into an opportunity for fellowship. And I don't think it takes away from the genius of these writers that, like, to be made aware of the impact that others had on their creative work. So when Peter spoke about relationships last month, he made the important point that the first human beings were created in relation to one another, that we're called to be in communion. And I think it's worth dwelling on that briefly because it forms a strong foundation for our understanding of the value and importance of friendship. It's a point that was also made by Paul Ricoeur in his work of philosophical ethics, Oneself as Another. In this book, Ricoeur acknowledges that to live ethically requires us to seek the good life with and for others within some form of community. So the good life is used in Aristotle's sense here, where flourishing or happiness, which he calls eudaimonia, it takes into account our ethical responsibilities, justice, our relationships, and it's where we're heading. It's our ultimate goal. So we aren't only called to be in communion, but we're ethically bound to live with and for others in the context of a community. I'd argue that the way the Inklings turn the solitary act of writing into a communal ritual of Christian friendship points to the truth of this. And this leads me to my next point. So these writers open themselves up to each other's critique. They made themselves vulnerable in the sharing of their creative work because they trusted each other to improve what they had started on their own. Tolkien said of his friendship with Lewis that he owed him an unpayable debt, not of influence, but of sheer encouragement. So Tolkien showed his earliest writings on Middle-earth to Lewis before anyone else had seen him, and before he even thought of them as something beyond himself. Lewis's enthusiasm, encouragement, helped not only to make the work better, but gave Tolkien the confidence he needed to continue the project, and he needed that to sustain him because it took almost 15 years to actually write The Lord of the Rings. So that's a lot of Tuesday night readings. So what this shows us is the valuable role friendships play by giving us a safe space to feel vulnerable, in encouraging us to share our goals with those who trust us, know us, and might see our value more than we do. Aristotle defined a friend as another self and saw friendship as a virtue, an excellence, so that was part of eudaimonia. I think Tolkien and Lewis bore out the truth of this in their friendship. They were other selves that would bring out the best in each other. The virtue of their friendship was that both men came away from it as better versions of themselves. And before the Inklings, Lewis had been searching for another self in just this way. He said in a letter, "Oh, for the people that speak one's own language." As a child, Lewis had first read the Icelandic sagas and Norse mythology, and he was struck by a sense of what he later called northernness. It was a sort of chill in the bones, but not a chill of dread. It was just a feeling of otherness, a thrill of something which he didn't understand, but for which he yearned. So this inner longing never left him, but as he grew older, this yearning played a central role in helping him to identify another self in Tolkien, but more significantly, in his conversion from atheism, which I'll come back to later. So Tolkien and Lewis bonded through discovering their shared love of Norse mythology. But it was more than just a common interest. It was the sense of northernness, that great yearning, which united them. I'll quote Lewis himself from his book, The Problem of Pain, which I realised as I was flicking through it for this talk, he actually dedicated that book to the Inklings. So Lewis says, "Are not all lifelong friendships born at the moment when at last you meet another human being who has some inkling, but faint and uncertain, even in the best, of that something which you were born desiring, and which, beneath the flux of other desires, and in all the momentary silences between the louder passions, night and day, year for year, from childhood to old age, you are looking for, watching for, listening for. So to draw back to Lewis's earlier quote, finding those people that spoke his own language enabled Lewis's eventual conversion. So much like Augustine, Lewis's conversion happened in stages. So most notably a conversion of the mind and then a conversion of the heart. And for Augustine, his conversion started with an intellectual decision that Christianity made sense. And incidentally, it was a friendship with St. Ambrose that formed a big part of this conversion. And it was a friendship that was aided through their shared background in rhetoric. They spoke the same language. However, the intellectual decision to be a Christian only took him so far. In a mystical moment in a garden in Milan, he had his conversion of the heart that allowed him to finally live out his faith. For Lewis, similarly, his first conversion was one of the mind. He came to the rationalisation that God must exist, but he held out on Christianity. In a late night walk in a garden after dinner with Tolkien and Hugo Dyson, who was another member of the Inklings, Lewis challenged his friends on the value of the myth of the death and resurrection of Jesus. It didn't seem to him entirely different from the myths in his own beloved Norse mythology. But Tolkien talked about the value of myths as inklings of a greater truth. Poets in their creative activity express something of the creative mind of God. The death and resurrection of Jesus works on our imagination in the same way as myths, with the crucial difference being that this myth happens to be true. So the role of Tolkien and Dyson in Lewis's conversion was a gift of grace. To break down Lewis's determined rationalism, they needed to speak Lewis's language. Through countless meetings and hours of shared creativity and thought and vulnerability, these friends were able to articulate something to Lewis in a way which answered and fulfilled a deep longing. So to recap, we're made and ethically bound for relationships. Through the Inklings, we see the value of friendship as a vehicle for vulnerability and as a means to extend ourselves. Our friendships provide us with unique commonalities, which are opportunities for grace. For the remainder of the talk, I want to zoom in on Lewis's writings about friendship and love and close with some reflections on what they might reveal to us as a community. So in The Four Loves, which is very certainly influenced by Lewis's own experience and his own friendships, he explores 4 categories of love. And these include storge, affection, which is affection or familiarity, philia, which is friendship, eros, which is romance, and agape, which he describes as charity. So I'll focus today on affection and friendship. In The Four Loves, consistent with how he puts it in The Problem of Pain, Lewis suggests that in friendship, 2 people have, in some degree, drawn apart together from the herd. As mentioned earlier, for Lewis and Tolkien, this drawing apart was due to their common love of myths. This was a unique aspect about themselves, which they happened to share. As Lewis describes, it's taking 2 people at their highest level of individuality, where they've identified that thing that sets them apart. Lewis's expression of this is something to the effect of, "What? I thought I was the only one." Another way to think of it is that friends see the same truth. However, as fiercely separate and removed as this sounds, Lewis believes that friendship is at its best when it is shared, not hoarded. Peter made this point last month as well, when he said that our gift of committed relationships is given to others to share in. It's not just for us. Unlike romantic love, friendship has something about it which should draw others into its fold. Lewis views romance as 2 people facing each other, looking into each other's eyes, whereas friendship is 2 people side by side, both looking at some other thing. And this is why it allows for expansion, because 3 or 30 people could all be side by side, looking at a common point, all bringing their unique perspectives to that thing. Lewis says, in each of my friends, there is something that only some other friend can fully bring out. Lewis and Tolkien had a highly successful friendship for decades, but we see it expressed most fully through the form of the Inklings. That is, it was something which drew others in. Friendship, and here I'm quoting Lewis again, exhibits a glorious nearness of resemblance to heaven itself, where the very multitude of the blessed increases the fruition which each has of God. For every soul, seeing him in her own way, doubtless communicates that unique vision to all the rest. That is why the seraphim in Isaiah's vision are crying, "Holy, holy, holy," to one another. The more we thus share the heavenly bread between us, the more we shall all have. So Lewis describes friendship as what? I thought I was the only one. Whereas he describes affection as old clothes. Where friendship will likely be brought about through a moment of realisation of something in common, affection happens more gradually and usually without us realising it. Lewis says, affection seeps, almost sinks through our lives. It lives with humble undress, private things, soft slippers, old clothes, old jokes, the thump of a sleeping dog's tail on the kitchen floor, the sound of a sewing machine. It's worth underlining at this point that Lewis's 4 categories of love don't exist in isolation. We don't either have an eros love or a philia love. They may often and do go together to varying degrees. And Lewis sees affection as the type of love which goes best with others. So what does all this mean for us as a community, given to each other in committed relationships? I would argue that it is a combination of affection and friendship that we experience most profoundly and generally in community life, that our relationships are guided by these 2 forms of love. I'll allow Lewis to make this point for me. It's a bit of a long quote, so I better get a drink. So Lewis says, affection broadens our minds. Of all the natural loves, it is the most Catholic, the least finical, the broadest. The people with whom you are thrown together in the family, the college, the mess, the ship, the religious house, are from this point of view a wider circle than your friends, however numerous, whom you have made for yourself in the outer world. By having a great many friends, I do not prove that I have a wide appreciation of human excellence. You might say to me, you chose those friends. Of course they suit you. The truly wide-tasting humanity will find something to appreciate in the cross-section of humanity whom one has to meet every day. In my experience, it is affection that creates this taste, teaching us first to notice, then to endure, then to smile at, then to enjoy, and finally to appreciate the people who happen to be there. Made for us? Thank God, no. They are themselves odder than you could have believed and worth more than you could have guessed. So I suggest that this conception perfectly captures the experience of communion that we seek in our community. We're a group of people thrown together, not sought out, and over time and patience and familiarity, that affection, or communion, forms. We are old clothes. But Lewis qualifies that for affection as a form of love to be truly successful and produce the greatest fulfilment, something more and other than affection must be added. Affection in and of itself is not enough. And the reason for this is that we are also, much as the Inklings were, people searching for something just outside our reach. People who have been surprised by joy, to use another famous Lewis concept. We are people who meet each other and say, what? I thought I was the only one. We abound then in the love that is friendship, a withness brought about through being in committed relationships with one another. Through the rhythm of community life, where each sharing group is its own unique form of the Inklings, each gathering is an opportunity to gradually, and without even realising it, grow in affection for one another. We have a yearning in common. We stand side by side, looking to that shared focal point, which is the resurrected Christ. And that brings me to my final example, which is perhaps the most obvious: Jesus and his disciples. So the God of the universe could have come down in majesty and power and imparted his truth immediately and for all time, like flicking on a light switch. But instead, he chose to reveal his truth through personal relationships, personal friendships. He spent days, weeks, years with his friends until they became as comfortable with each other as old clothes. And then, because it is how friendship works, those disciples shared that friendship, that relationship with others. In a great exponential burst of affection, the church grew. And what could feel more like putting on old clothes for us than stepping into any church today? So I'll just finish with a prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you for your love, and we ask you to show us your love. We thank you for these relationships which you have put us into as a community. We pray that we can work for these relationships, that just like old clothes need to be mended and cared for, that we can put in the work to maintain these old clothes. Lord, we ask you to draw us deeper together so that we can, as a body, draw deeper into you and into your love. Help us to continually grow in our friendship, in our affection for each other. That your love will bind us together, Lord. Amen.